Hi, I'm Deborah Mobies of Whipstitch. In previous episodes of the How to Quilt video series, we've worked with squares, rectangles, and half square triangles. And now we're going to move it up a notch and work with half rectangle triangles in this episode of How to Quilt. Like a lot of people, when I was in school, I took geometry. It was not my best math class. I wasn't bad at math. I like math. Geometry was not my best math class. And so the irony of my life is that I work with a lot of geometry. I do math all the time. In quilting, there are a lot of shapes that we can make in different ways, very, very simply using right angles. Half rectangle triangles, rather than working with 90-degree angles and 45-degree angles like a half square triangle does, ask us to work with a different angle at the center of the unit. The challenge that a lot of people have with half rectangle triangles, and the reason I think a lot of people don't use them very often, is that you can't make twin half rectangle triangles as easily as you can half square triangles. Which is to say, when you put two rectangles together, if you sew from corner to corner, you don't get two rectangles at the other side by the nature of how the shape opens out. Instead, you have to use some techniques in order to put your half rectangle triangles together so that the angles work out in your favor. In this episode of How to Quilt, we're making half rectangle triangles one at a time. If you upgrade to the How to Quilt Premium Edition, I have another technique to share with you for how to make multiple half rectangle triangles at a time. But in this one, we're going to master the geometry and kind of wrap our brains around the shape as we make a very cool jewel-inspired diamonds quilt block for your sampler quilt. Like our other quilt blocks, I have already pre-cut the pieces for my diamonds block. These are all rectangles that measure 4.5 by 7.5 inches. They've all been treated ahead of time with spray stabilizer because we're going to be working with bias edges and I want to make sure they're good and crisp. I should say at this stage that if you are working with printed fabrics, because of the nature of how we're working with these, you will need twice as many pieces for printed fabrics that you will for solid fabrics. So let's go ahead and cut these apart and then I'll demonstrate for you why that is. I've got for this E and the G fabric, which form sort of the foundation of our block, I've got 2 of each of those. And then for C, D, F, and H, I have 1 each. Again, double the number if you're working with printed fabrics. Let's start with just this one. And I'm going to use my rotary cutter. This is in the instructions for your block. To go from point to point and cut. All right. When I separate these out, these are half rectangle triangles. If I'm looking at a printed fabric here, and what I need is 1 left and 1 right, this is the wrong side of a printed fabric. So if you are working with printed fabrics for these half rectangle triangles, you'll need to cut 1 this direction and 1 this direction in order to have a left triangle and a right triangle in order to make the pattern work. So as I'm working here, if I want to turn these into half rectangle triangles, like this, right? But I need one to be going this way. With a solid fabric, easy peasy. I only have to worry about doing this before I stitch so that my seam can be on the wrong side of the fabric. With a printed fabric, I have to cut these 2 different ways. Once this way and once this way. So in the instructions for the diamonds quilt block, you'll see it written for solid fabrics because that's what I'm working with. If you are working with printed fabrics, everything you do to one, do to the second, but in the opposite direction because we want mirrored pieces for the purposes of our quilt block. All right, I'm going to work through the remainder of my triangles and cut all of them apart in exactly the same manner that I've done these. Now that my pieces are cut out, I'm orienting them in the exact same manner as in the illustration to make sure that I'm putting everything together accurately. And again, because I'm working with solids, I can flip my pieces back and forth in order to make sure my seams are oriented correctly. If you are working with prints, you'll have to pay closer attention to the direction of your cut as you work your way through. The other thing we have to think about as we work with our half rectangle triangle is the effect that the shape of the triangle has on the seam as we sew it. So, for example, if I put these two right sides together and I put this edge right at the tip, and then I stitch a 1/4 inch seam, so I'll lay my ruler down at a 1/4 inch and fold it back so you can see the effect. Do you see how this edge here this one's too high and this one's not wide enough? So the whole thing has been offset by that seam. Because of the nature of this triangle, we actually have to shift just slightly here in order to put the seam in the correct place. So there's this ruler again, and I'm setting it at a 1/4 inch, and I'm going to draw it back again. Do you see the difference there? That now this edge comes to a nice square point, and so does this one. I have taken this triangle and I have shifted it so that 1/4 inch of the tip of this triangle extends beyond, because I don't care if this point matches. I care if they are aligned at the seam, which is here. So that's what I'll do for all of them. I will align them in such a way that 1/4 inch extends beyond the point, and then stabilize it with pins before taking it to the sewing machine. The remainder all get laid out in exactly the same fashion. And I'm going to do this with my pattern right next to me, matching everything up. So each of these fabrics gets one of the darker background and one of the lighter, and they get pinned together before we go to the machine and sew. All my pieces are matched. I was really careful as I went to refer specifically to this illustration in the pattern so that while I was working, I knew I was making the correct pieces. I just don't want to have to do it over, and it's easier to check as I'm working. At the machine, these sew up very similarly to our half square triangles. So I put my tip in, and you can see the needle is up against the spot where they join at my 1/4 inch seam allowance. If it's not flawless, I have some margin to trim. And as it comes off the other edge, it should come pretty close to that join. And we can chain stitch if we want. Like a lot of the quilt blocks that are included in the How to Quilt sampler, these are slightly oversized, which gives you some room to trim them down, but we do have to think about our seam allowances when we do that in order to ensure that our half rectangle triangles go together efficiently. Back from the iron, and I've got my half rectangle triangles stitched up and ready to go. Because I made allowance for that 1/4 inch, They're fairly squared off on the corners, but I still need to trim them down. They're slightly oversized to give me room to trim them down. Now let's say these were half square triangles. This is a quarter square triangle, but you get the idea. If I trim up and I trim over, because the length of each side is the same, I can trim the same amount off each side and I'm still going to have this line at the point. But with a half rectangle triangle, if I trim up and then trim over, even if it's the same amount, because the dimensions are different, I won't get this line going all the way into the corner. So I have to pay close attention to how I trim this in order to make sure that when I stitch them back together, this seam line ends up in the corner and I get a really pretty point. So if I'm using a regular ruler, this is a 6.5 inch square. My target size is 6.5 by 3.5. I can put this point there in the corner and then I can go 1, 2, 3, there's my half. And I want the other half to be here. But I run into the same issue. If I trim it so that the seam goes all the way in the corner and then I stitch a 1/4 inch and a 1/4 inch, this seam line still isn't in that point, that corner of the block. So I actually have to twist it just a smidge. Do you see how it's kinked a little bit? It's not cutting square. In order to ensure that I've got a 1/4 inch beyond this corner and above this corner. So I'm actually twisting it so the 1/4 inch line intersects with this seam line before I trim it off. This is how you do it with a regular ruler. There are also specialty rulers, like this split rectangle ruler, made specifically for this particular quilting problem. And here's how that works. It's got the 6.5 by 3.5 target size, which is what we're going for. It also has this diagonal line here, and you can see that it's got markings for that 1/4 inch. So in the same way that I indicated before on our standard 6.5 inch square ruler, that I have to take this edge and kink it up just a smidge in order to get it to fit, I can lay this diagonal line on the diagonal of my half rectangle triangle and then trim. So there's one edge, and the seam does not go into the corner, but that is desirable at this stage. When I flip it around, I take this target size, my 6.5 by 3.5, I line that up with my edges. This diagonal line is still going through my diagonal, and I trim again. Now, I am not about encouraging you to buy a bunch of tools, but this tool exists in the world for a reason, and that's because this shape makes some really great quilt blocks, and it's just a little tricky to get with this ruler. Can you get it? Of course you can. Once you have the right shape, something some quilters make is a little template for themselves. They make a little cardboard drawing that indicates this 1/4 inch here, 1/4 inch here, so that they can cut these out. Or you can purchase a specialty ruler for exactly that purpose. Let's say though that I've got a unit where the angle's going the opposite direction. So here I've got whoop, and here I've got whoop. Come back, and again with this specialty ruler, 3 by 6 finished unit. That's us. I lay that line on my seam, taking care as I do that my 6.5 by 3.5 finished size will lie entirely inside the body of my unit. I don't want to over trim and leave myself with no margin. So the first cut, and then flip it around, and then I've got my 6.5 by 3.5 finished size, still with this line right there, and trim again. And now I have 2 mirrored units, both trimmed to size. it's a simple matter of using the layout in your pattern to assemble the various pieces into our block. I want you to think too, we've talked about our blocks being gridded. This is 6.5 tall and 3.5 inch wide. 3.5 plus 3.5 minus a 1/2 inch seam allowance is 6.5. So it's a 6.5 inch square. So when I lay out 4 6.5 inch squares, it is a 2x2 grid that I've created. If you've been paying attention to the geometry of the 12-inch finished quilt blocks that we're making for our How to Quilt sampler quilt, you will recognize as we put these units together that 3-6 repetition that comes up over and over. We've made more than one block where it was 3 inches tall by 6 inches wide. The difference in this Diamonds quilt block is that they are 3 inches wide and 6 inches tall. But hopefully your brain is starting to recognize that repetition and the patterning so that it makes assembling the block almost a no-brainer for you. You can start to see, I will be sewing these together in a row, and then I'll be sewing my rows together into a block. And then just as with all of our other blocks, we go across, across, and then one row to the next. And you can see, because of the shape that we have, we get this gemstone effect where it appears like facets of a diamond. So it is a diamond shape, but it also has this more little optical illusion with our fabric. You can also see how, because of the structure of the half rectangle triangles, if you're using a print fabric, you're just going to have a little more waste than you might if you're using a solid fabric, because you can't flip those triangles the opposite direction and use the other side. But if you're making more than one block, that becomes irrelevant. As you put your pieces right sides together, anywhere you can, nest those seams so that you can get really pretty points where those angled seams come together. Hopefully, at this point, you've picked up a couple things during the How to Quilt video series. So I'm crossing my fingers that you're thinking, oh, Deborah, these are 6.5 inch units. Now would be a great time to trim these down and square them up before I assemble my rows and then my blocks. After one final press, there's our finished block. I feel like the seam got a little lumpy, but other than that, I'm really satisfied with the overall appearance. I can give it a nice trim up at the end here, using the 6 inch mark in my 12.5 inch ruler to make sure everything's nice and square. And that's that. And there we have it. That is the Diamonds quilt block made with half rectangle triangles. I love the way you can use your fabric selection to play around a little bit with the visual effect of this block. And hopefully now, if you take a break, kind of halfway-ish through our quilt, you can back up from the blocks that you've made and begin to see the ways that the shapes and the angles and the seam lines in the blocks create visual movement and interest across the body of your quilt. Coming up, we're going to move into some new techniques that go beyond traditional piecing, which include applique, curved piecing, and even foundation papers in the next episodes of How to Quilt.